Welcome to Episode 2 of this World War II essay series presented by Historic Autographs. Before saying anything else, I want to set the tone here. This episode will be about the Axis powers: Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and militarized Japan. Episode 1 had a fair share of tongue-in-cheek humor, which is possible at all for two main reasons. For one, it's been a while since World War II, and second, history is fascinating. World War II was and is, in the most objective sense, a complicated and incredibly interesting narrative, and in America, that narrative is often told through the lens of triumph, which makes it quite suitable to recount with a jovial tone, almost like a Greek myth or a Shakespeare play. But when you tell history as a story that is over, it's easy to compress the suffering, the starvation, the war camps, the bloodshed, serious topics that deserve reverence. This series, ideally, will have a balance of levity and seriousness. I don't intend to make light of the themes at the forefront of this video. With that said, let's talk fascism. Fascism is a term with a bit of ambiguity. It doesn't have as clean of a definition as something like monarchy, and this is for a lot of reasons. Fascism feels a bit like a gradient in that people tend to have varying definitions, using it to imply a situation as anything from exactly what Mussolini did in Italy to dangerously authoritarian. It might sound a bit like a soundbitey buzzword, and that makes sense. The idea of fascism as a product of World War I and a feature of World War II was dispersed in the context of propaganda, which has to be easily digestible. We can learn a lot by going back to the origin of the term and how it was first used. The term fascist comes from Italy's fascisti, the party under Benito Mussolini who took forcible control of Italy in October of 1922. Mussolini's fascist party and the governmental policy became a reference for what fascism looks like, and it tends to look loosely the same across multiple nations. Fascism is many things, but first and foremost, it is an extreme form of nationalism, in which the nation is of higher importance than the citizen. Note, that doesn't mean doing things for your nation is fascism. There's a subtle but important tonal difference. Fascist governments establish a nebulous and glorious national identity and pride that is worth dying and killing for. This national identity is defined by a strong, centralized government. Totalitarian and authoritarian are similar important terms. A fascist state will have an all-powerful government, will violently suppress dissent within their own nation, and have the means or seek the means to have the final say in the lives of its citizens, in anything from careers to privileges to property to, if they can, beliefs. These are embodied by a supreme leader. Fascist dictatorships are built around their dictator, and usually there's a lot of propaganda that pushes the idea that this leader is infallible, has your best interests at heart, and is also attractive. That's normally part of it. Admittedly, those 3 points are kind of vague. One of them is just has a dictator, but there's also a pattern in how fascist governments maintain and manifest those 3 points that help identify them as fascist. The biggest flags are the other and expansionism. These two are fun because they're paradoxal. A fascist government will usually tell its citizens it is the strongest in the world and everyone fears them and your nation is so powerful you can do whatever you want, like invade Poland. It will also tell you that the other, a minority of some kind, is working day and night to manufacture all of the problems in your great nation. And if you could just expel that group of inherently lesser evil dissenters from your nation, you would no longer be held back. It's a paradox, because the nation has to appear strong enough to defeat every other nation in combat, but weak enough to be severely hampered by the actions of a minority outcast group with no access to the state's governmental functions. Both of those are propaganda tools, of course, but they are very common symptoms of nations with fascist goals and pride. Fascism flourishes when there is an enemy, and if there isn't an enemy, it makes one, or several. As mentioned earlier, the term fascism comes from Italy's fascisti. They were one of the first modern fascist nations, and they became that back in World War I. Prior to World War I, Italy had spent a great deal of recent history fractured and fighting for independence from occupiers and then unification because they had more than a few different kings. They successfully united under one king, Victor Emmanuel II. And then the Industrial Revolution hit. And while some parts of Italy industrialized, other parts got left behind with a bunch of Italians emigrated, so they had to unify again, and so then they took on some colonies, and World War I happened, and despite having been technically allied with Germany, they joined the alliance so they could gain territory and pause. Leading up to World War II, they started behaving a little more like an empire, having imperial colonies and kinda switching sides for the sake of territory expansion. What's more important, however, is what happens next. Italy does not benefit greatly from the war. They lose a lot of soldiers, and they don't get all the land they want, and they spent a lot of money, so the country flounders a little bit. Socialists make a play for power, following in the footsteps of the recent Russian Revolution, but the existing establishment suppresses it. The Russian Revolution famously went very poorly for Russian elites, and they're not a fan of that. And that's when Mussolini's party marches into Rome and is handed control of Italy. Very much just handed. Mussolini and a group of his fascist party, known as Black Shirts, marched into Rome to stage a coup, and Victor Emmanuel III, the king, put up no fight and declared Mussolini prime minister. The kingdom remained, but the government worked with Mussolini, seeing him as a strong, decisive, and charismatic leader who could finally shore up Italy's fragmented political structure. This is where the fascism happened with little to no pretense. As prime minister, Mussolini banned political parties, which is just overtly saying no more organized groups with different opinions than mine, and he established himself as Il Duce, or the boss, or Italy's new supreme leader. His black shirts were his enforcement, and he established a secret police known as the OVRA, which in English stands for Organization for Vigilance and the Repression of Anti-Fascism. The OVRA was to infiltrate civilian social circles, root out discontent, and have any dissenting voices imprisoned, exiled, and/or executed. Needless to say, freedom was not a feature of the average Italian's life at this point. Citizens were made very aware that to resist the will of the government was to be labeled a traitor. Italy used its ties to ancient Rome to justify expansion, invading Ethiopia and Albania and joining the Axis to further expand their borders. They also supported Francisco Franco during Spain's civil war, helping him briefly become a dictator. It's worth noting that a fun quirk of fascism, or just autocracy in general, is that dictators like to help out other dictators. But that's just pattern recognition. Italy joined World War II in 1940, and weren't incredibly successful in their pursuits of expansion. They did commit war crimes, though. The other of Mussolini's fascist regime, at least for this period of time, were Yugoslavians, whom Mussolini forced into internment camps alongside a handful of other ethnic groups. It was super easy for Mussolini to find scapegoats. Italy was invading Yugoslavia, so they just said all Yugoslavians are evil, so they could justify the invasion and vilify any Italian citizens objecting to the horrendous treatment of Yugoslav prisoners. Mussolini's regime would eventually fall. In July of 1943, after America had joined the war, the Allies staged several operations to take back Europe. Operation Husky was the mission to retake control of the Mediterranean, starting with Sicily. And, spoiler alert, it was a success. King Victor Emmanuel III, still king, albeit more of a figurehead, worked with the parliament to hold a vote of no confidence for their dictator Mussolini, imprisoned him, and signed an armistice with the Allies. Though this just split the country into Allied Italians and Italian fascists, who continued to fight amongst themselves and in the war. Eventually, Mussolini tried to escape, but was caught by the Italian resistance, and I'm not sure I should describe in detail what happened to him. It's hard to verify the sources, and some of them get pretty graphic. Even if you haven't learned much about Japan's history, you might have heard about the Edo period from 1608 to 1838, in which Japan's borders were completely closed to outside influence. The Edo period ended when America sent the Perry expedition to Japan to force them to open up, because it was the 1800s and all the big countries wanted to have their influence everywhere on the globe. The influence of global politics and lots of infighting gave way to the Meiji period, which continued through to 1912, and saw Japan rapidly industrialize ahead of their Asian neighbors. What did they do with all this industrial power? They invaded. They invaded Korea and China and Russia and Taiwan, and the list goes on. The Japanese Empire quickly expanded, especially when they helped win World War I and got a fair share of German colonies. Following the Meiji period, which, by the way, was named for the Emperor Meiji, was followed by the Taisho period, named for Emperor Taisho, who started introducing democratic ideals. In the long run, though, they couldn't find roots. Japan's empire was going strong, but the post-World War I period was filled with lots of crises and political influence that kept the government reacting to things. Reacting to pressure from progressives, pushback from conservatives, civil disobedience, the communist movements, earthquakes, and of course, the American stock market crash. Political tensions also made for high-impact moments like political assassinations and attacks, and all of that meant that Japan's government was a tug-of-war that prevented foundational change and stability. Whatever party ruled would just get hit with a crisis that caused the people to lose faith in them. But there was a group that didn't change between parties: the military. Japan's government did implement and practice democracy, but Japan was an empire with imperial behavior like colonies, and an emperor who was never fully removed, even with the democratic elections and a constitution. So when the government failed to provide stability, discontent turned to unrest, turned to attempted coups, and the government responded with the centralization of power to maintain order. The government began to revolve around their military and military might. They began to criminalize speaking out against the government, and they demonized democracy as a threat to national stability. They invested the national identity in the power of their military, and so the primary goal of this unified, statist Japanese regime was to expand. It wasn't a big leap. They were doing that long before the 30s. Remember how I said Japan invaded China? On September 18th, 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region of China north of the Korean peninsula, and they occupied the area with enough of a foothold to create the puppet state of Manchukuo. This invasion is considered by some to be an alternative start of World War II, long before 1939. Just remember that bit about the puppet state, it comes back later. Japan's expansionist goals fit very nicely with Germany's expansionist goals, since at the very least Germany wasn't going to be anywhere near the Pacific for a while. So in 1936, Japan and Nazi Germany signed a pact to fight evil progressive communists together, the Anti-Comintern Pact, and in 1940, Japan joined the Axis alongside Italy. Japan continued to expand in the Pacific with its powerful navy, including cutting-edge aircraft carriers. The natives of areas they took over were often horribly abused, turned into slaves at the mercy of whatever military unit conquered them. Then, Japan attacked British forces and Pearl Harbor, spurring America to join the war and opening a front in the Pacific between Japan and the US. That front would move very slowly, because despite America's vast military resources, Japan had strong control of the Pacific Islands that stand between America and the heart of Japan. But you know how it ends, or at least you know that it ends. While America pressures the Pacific, with the rest of the war leaning in favor of the Allies, August 9th, 1945, saw the launch of Operation August Storm, in which Soviet Russia invaded the puppet state of Manchukuo. And for the sake of time, we'll return in a later video to discuss the use of nuclear weapons which ended World War II. For now, it's time we move on to the center of the Axis. Episode 1 was rather Germany-centric, but that just means now we can zoom in a little. Following World War I, Germany shortly became the Weimar Republic, starting in 1918. This constitutional government was headed by an elected president who appointed a chancellor to oversee separate executive matters. This government was serving well enough to rebuild Germany following the Treaty of Versailles, with the 20s seeing economic and industrial recovery and even growth, as well as mending of foreign affairs that was required given they just attempted to take over the continent. But it always comes back to the Great Depression. Germany was never fully stabilized. There were splintered groups advocating for continued aggression or adopting communism. There were attempted assassinations and coups, and as we mentioned before, a very widespread loathing for how the world regarded Germany. German citizens were desperate for stability and security, and the Great Depression offered the complete and utter opposite. It looked like everything the new republic had built was going to come crashing down, with industry failing and mass unemployment. It was during this period of uncertainty that a certain political party was able to rise to prominence. Let's go back to 1920 real quick and see what was happening in the background. Adolf Hitler was a member of the Nazi Party, a small, angry group which stood against what it saw to be the corrupting influence of capitalism, Marxism, and Judaism. He joined in 1920, years before the Depression, but it's not like Germany wasn't suffering. He stood out because of a latent talent for public speaking, and helped the party gain prominence, later arguing with leadership and strong-arming himself into the position of party chairman. He was charismatic, and his fiery determination to reclaim the glory of the German Empire was like a drug for citizens lamenting the collapse of their society. Germany was unstable because of a tangle of problems: the economy, political infighting, foreign interference kicking them while they were down. But those were hard to act on, especially democratically, since it takes time for democratic systems to decide on solutions. Hitler made things sound simple. He and his Nazi party advocated very actively and very loudly for Germany to fight back against the oppressive treatment codified in Versailles. His speeches always featured boisterous German nationalism with themes of German superiority, and then they also featured vitriolic outrage against the Marxists and Jews who he claimed were undermining German society, sabotaging it. A major part of his platform from the beginning was to hold these groups accountable for their perceived subterfuge. They proved to be effective scapegoats. In 1923, inspired by Mussolini's march and coup, Hitler attempted a coup himself, which failed. He was arrested and charged with treason, then sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he only spent about 1 comfortable year there before being pardoned and let out. Part of his stay was used to write his book, Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle, a good chunk of which outlines his desires to completely exterminate Jewish people. By 1924, he was back at it. Initially, he was fighting an uphill battle, as in the mid-1920s, Germany was doing much better, and it was harder to get people fired up about oppression. Come 1929, though, people had a lot of reasons to hate. Citizens were moved by his charismatic and energetic speeches, and those who chose to follow and vote for the party, not a majority by any means, either readily accepted his scapegoat rhetoric, wrote it off as a side argument, or believed he would do more good than harm. The Nazi Party won seats in parliament and spent the next few years gaining more traction. Hitler ran against President Paul von Hindenburg in 1932 and lost, but at this point he was one of the most prominent political figures in the country. And on January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor. Quick, important side note: with the chaos of the time period and Germany's instability, it had been becoming more common for the government to create policy by decree. That is, going around democratic channels for the sake of expediency, in executive order. This is important because about a month later, the Reichstag building, a major government office, was set on fire. presumably by a member of the Communist Party. The Nazi Party, in response, passed a bill allowing them to detain and arrest without trial on the grounds that they were maintaining order. They arrested the entire Communist Party, which was notably the main opposition of the Nazi Party. In March of 1933, the government passed the Nazi Party's Enabling Act, giving the Nazi Party the ability to pass executive policy superseding democratic process and the Constitution for 4 years, again arguing that the executive branch needed more centralized power to maintain order. German democracy was no more. With the ability to arrest anyone indefinitely for any reason, and pass laws without checks and balances, the Nazi Party efficiently and effectively established a dictatorship, taking military action against their political obstacles, performing executions without due process, etc. They built secret police and prison camps and made good on Hitler's promise to fight the Jews by imprisoning and massacring them, alongside dozens of other disenfranchised groups, ethnic communities, homosexuals, non-Nazi party members, anyone who they could feasibly suggest had an interest other than the success of their country. On August 2nd, 1934, President Hindenburg died, and there was already a policy in place to, upon such an event, merge the presidency and chancellorship into the Führer. Hitler's solution to the unemployment problem was to up deficit spending and rapidly militarize. We meet back up with Episode 1 here. Hitler annexed Austria and invaded Poland, and World War II began. There's a lot of fighting, and covering individual battles would be a lot for how long this video already is, but in terms of major beats, France fell in the summer in 1940 and was occupied by Germany and Italy. In 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, breaking a peace deal and opening a second front of the war. Then in the winter, Japan attacked several key points in the Pacific, finally dragging America into the fray. By 1942, Germany was simply fighting too many countries to make any headway, and by 1934, momentum was reversing, with Allies forcing Germany back out of occupied territory. On June 6, 1944, famously known as D-Day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy with the goal of retaking France. Allies won back territory in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Mediterranean. Germany was overrun. In April of 1945, Allies took Berlin. German forces surrendered on the 29th, and on the 30th, Hitler committed suicide. At least for Germany, the war was over by May. And that's enough for now. There's definitely much more to cover, but this episode, more so than some of the others, ought to stand apart. I find history fascinating, and I like displaying that fascination with jokes and editing gags, but there's a time and a place for those, and it's not here. In each of the 3 countries covered in this video, chaos was taken advantage of by violent people to inflict unimaginable pain. And the scary truth is that they thought they were fixing things. But if we can learn anything from history, it's that no matter how authoritarian, how tyrannical a government may be, people will always resist, and victory over oppression is just a matter of time. If there's a second thing we can learn, I'd say it's that the world is simply too big and too diverse for world domination to ever be a viable goal. Cheerio! I hope you enjoyed this, especially long, episode presented by Historic Autographs. Join us next time as we discuss the Allies. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more, and check out our website in the description for our products. Our upcoming World War II product will feature art cards, autographs, stickers, and more. See ya!